So in this case, it's given to us that f of x equals x squared. So we need to determine the minimum distance between the point 10 and 2, as well as any point that is lying on the function of f. And this is for 8 marks. So, well, it's very useful for us to make a sketch. And according to this sketch, this is where the point 10 and 2 is going to be. Now, with regards to the distance, we don't really know if it's a vertical distance or a horizontal distance or neither of these two. In other words, it's going to be anything between vertical and horizontal, which is in 2 dimensions. So I've actually sketched 3 possibilities for the distance. But since it is not specified whether it's a vertical distance or horizontal distance, you always assume it's that which is between horizontal and vertical, okay? In which case you need to use the distance formula. Now that's fine. Now, one thing we know is that any point that is lying on the function of f has the coordinates x and y, any point, okay? But since we understand that f of x is just the y value, it means the coordinates of this point will simply be x and x squared. So this is us. Let's go ahead and find the distance between the 2 points. Well, according to the distance formula, this distance is simply going to be the square root of x2 minus x1 squared, y2 minus y1, and then we say this is squared as well, all right? Okay, fine. Then we come and say, well, what is x2? Well, x2, we can say it's any x value on the function. So it's going to be x. Now, what about x1? Well, x1 is just going to be 10. And by the way, the order is not important. You could have chosen to say 10 minus x. That's fine. Then our y2 is any point on the function. So it's going to be x squared, as we said. And y1, well, it's just going to be 2. And then we simply square this. And here we are going to simplify what is inside the square root. But I want you to realize what you just did. Can you see that you got rid of y? So it means our distance is going to be in terms of x. So you can choose to call it d of x, the distance as a function of x. Okay, fine. So the question is, how do we simplify what is inside the square root? Well, according to the FOIL method, for this one, we are simply going to get x squared minus 10x minus 10x plus 10 squared. So I can choose to say it's negative 20x plus 100. So that's what I can say. Okay, fine. What about for this one? Well, using the FOIL method again, we get x to the power 4 minus 2x squared minus 2x squared. And then we say plus 4. So this is how it's going to look like. Okay, fine. Now collecting our like terms, then the x to the 4th is a lone wolf. And if you say 1 minus 4, well, you simply get 3, right? Okay. And then you come back and say, well, you still have your negative 20x and then you say 100 plus 4, it's just going to be 104. Now the question is, where to from this point? Well, easy. We just need to differentiate from this point, right? And this is what I want you to know. Whether you differentiate the distance function or you differentiate the square of the distance function, you're still going to get the same answer, okay? Now the question is, which one is easier to work with? Is it the distance function or is it the square of the distance function? Well, the square of the distance function is very easier to differentiate. So what are you going to do here? Well, you're going to square on both sides so that you get the square of the distance function, okay? Which we'll call s of x. So it means our s of x will be x to the fourth minus 3x squared minus 20x plus 104. Think of it. It's much easier to differentiate a polynomial function as opposed to a root function. I think you'll agree with me if I say that. So now we are ready to differentiate. So, well, this is what we say. Well, if you differentiate this one according to the power rule, you get 4x cubed. And here you get 6x. And here you get negative 20. And of course, the derivative of a constant is simply going to be 0. So we just leave it out, okay? After finding the derivative, we equate the derivative to 0. So we are simply going to say that, and we equate it to 0. But now immediately we realize that 2 is the highest common factor. So we take it out and divide by it on both sides. So we are left with 2x cubed minus 3x. And then we say minus 10. So now we need to solve for x, of course, by factorizing. And here we realize that we are dealing with a cubic function. So the question is, how would you factorize a cubic function? Well, I'm not really sure which method you're going to use. But here I'm just going to go to my calculator and try to find a factor, a linear factor of this cubic function, okay? So let's see, what do I get? So I simply press my mode and I go to table, which is number 3. And then I'm going to enter the function. So how is it going to look like? Well, guys, I hope you know how to enter the function on your calculator. So I'm going to start at -3 and at 3 with a step of 0.5. And if you are a university student, you don't need to stress. You just need to play trial and error, or you can use synthetic division in order to get your solution, or rather the factor. But if you're in high school, no. You can simply go to your calculator and do the thing. Yeah. So what are you looking for on your calculator? You are looking for a value of x for which the y value will be 0. That's a factor. That's an x-intercept of your function, okay? Well, here we can see that x equals 2 is actually a solution. When x is 2, y is going to be 0. So that's the only one I can find on my calculator. So now we need to write it as a factor. So before it became x equals 2, it was once x minus 2 equals 0. Now this is the most important thing. If you take out a linear factor from a quadratic factor, In fact, if you take out a linear factor from a cubic function, you're going to be left with a quadratic factor. That's what I wanted to say. And so what we need to do here is to find this quadratic factor, the values of a, b, and c, and then factorize the quadratic function. So the question is, how do we do this? Well, it's very easy. In order to find the value of a, we just say x multiplied by ax squared. So we get ax cubed. And then we are going to equate this to 2x cubed, okay? So this means the value of a has to be 2. So now we come for c, because it's very easy to find a and c. So you take your 2 and you multiply it by your constant. So you get negative 2c. And you equate this to the constant in your cubic equation. So you say it's negative 10. And dividing both sides, of course, you find that your c will be 5. Okay, fine. Then what about for b? Well, here I need to open your eyes very much widely. So this is how you begin. You take this x and you multiply it by bx so that you get bx squared. And then you come back and take this constant, multiply it by ax squared. So since we know that the value of a is 2, then it means negative 2 by 2 is, what is it? Well, it's negative 4, and then you say x squared. And if you look at your cubic equation, you don't really have a term that has a square, right? So you equate this to 0. And then you take your x squared out. So it means the value of b has to be equal to 4. Yes, it means the value of b has to be equal to 4. Okay, so what? So now it means we are just going to have x minus 2, which is multiplied by 2x squared. And then we say plus 8x. And then for the constant, we say 5. And this is equal to 0, all right? So now we can say x equals 2, or this thing equals 0. The question is, can we factorize this? No, it's not really factorizable, if that's the right way of saying it. Why? Why is it not factorizable? Well, it's because your delta is going to be 0. What do I mean? If you try to use the quadratic formula, what is inside the square root is simply going to be 0. Well, I can show you real quick, right? Because it's almost difficult. In fact, it's very difficult to factorize quadratic functions whereby the coefficient of x squared is not 1. So to save you the trouble, then the quadratic formula is the best way out. And according to the quadratic formula, we have negative b, and our b is 8. Wait, why is b 8? B is supposed to be 4. Sorry, guys. Sorry about that. Yeah, supposed to be 4. So here I'm supposed to say it's negative b plus or minus square root b squared. So 4 squared is 16. Then you say minus 4a. And then you say c, right? And right away you can see that, well, 2 by 5 is 10 and 4 by 10 is 40. And 16 minus 40 is a negative answer. So we don't have a solution for this one. So the only solution that exists is x equals 2. So maybe here you can just tell them that 2x squared plus 4x plus 5 cannot be equal to 0. Or you can simply write no solution. Okay, fine. So what is the meaning of x equals 2? Well, it's just the x coordinate of the turning point. So if you are in high school, you are perfectly happy to leave it as x equals 2. You don't need to say anything further. But if you are a university student, remember, you need to convince us that x equals 2 is indeed at the absolute minimum. For high school learners, it's the local minimum, but for university students, it's the absolute minimum. And of course, you know the difference between the two. Well, if you're a high school and then you don't know the difference between the two, but you don't need to stress. You're still young for that. Okay, fine. So I've already shown you how to prove beyond reasonable doubt for university students, right? So it makes sense for me to skip that step in this example because I shown you in a different example. Because it's readily available on our YouTube channel. I think it's optimization word problem number 1. So yeah, you'll get to see how to use the first derivative test for extreme values. Okay, fine. So now that we know x equals 2, then what are we saying? This is the x value for which the distance will be a minimum. But the question didn't say calculate the x value such that the distance will be a minimum. No, the question actually said calculate the minimum distance itself. Okay? Okay, so how do we do that? Well, it's easy. We go to the distance function and we want to find the distance when x is 2, all right? So we can easily go to this part. We don't go to the square of the distance. We go to the distance function. So you're just going to find the square root. Then you say, what is 2 to the power 4? Well, it's 16. And 2 squared is 4. 4 times 3 is 12. 20 times 2, well, it's 40. And then you say this is added to 104. So if you say 16 minus 12 minus 40 plus 104, well, you're simply going to get the square root of 68. And what is the square root of 68? Well, if you like, you can just say 68 can be written as 4 times 17 if you want to simplify it further. And then you'll say the square root of 4 is 2. So yeah, this will just be your minimum distance. Of course, you can conclude nicely and say, therefore, the minimum distance is just going to be 2 square root 17 units. And if we said this, they're going to be so happy in the exam that they give you all your full 8 marks. Thank you so much, guys, for watching.